Erte pulled at the tattered plastic tarp that was her only clothing, squinting in the dust. She cinched the rope tightly around her waist, tying it to make the tarp a bit like the silken robes the fat traders wore. The blisters on her feet were ruptured and bleeding, pus and blood mixing with the dirt under her mangled toes. Her lips were split and flaking from dehydration. Still not half a kilometer ahead, she saw the silhouette of Howler's Inn, and she smiled. 170 kilometers, give or take, up a mountain and down again. The north slope was easy. The south slope, a labyrinth of jagged rocks and mostly uneroded obsidian. Then 3 days slowly crossing the aptly named Cactus Mesa. Each step had to be carefully examined, lest she be lamed by a footful of barbed needles. The second day on the mesa, in the shade of an acacia tree, she used a fallen branch to clear a small area of the spiny succulents, just enough to lie down and stretch her aching body. In the sunlight, she dug a small hole and filled it with cactus. Even being quite ginger, she still managed to catch a few needles in her hands, yanking them out of the calluses without so much as a yelp. In the middle of the hole, she placed the wide-mouthed jug she had stolen before beginning this trek. She took off the plastic tarp, revealing her naked body to the dust and wind, and laid it over the hole, weighing down the edges so it wouldn't collapse inward. Finally, she dropped a few pebbles in the middle of the tarp, creating a depression that pointed directly into the jug. Satisfied with her construction, she retreated to the trunk of the acacia to minimize her exposure. She stretched out her legs and let her mind turn off. She thought of nothing. She ignored the grit under her fingernails and in the folds of her skin. She ran her remaining fingers down her ribs, counting the 12 bumps, her skin as tight against her body as the top of a drum. Her knees looked bulbous compared to her legs, and her ankles jutted outward. It had been weeks since she'd seen herself in a glass, but she could imagine how hollow her face had become. She was so beautiful once. Never mind, time to sleep. For a while. Erte awoke stiffer than usual, but feeling a little better. She crawled out to the pit she had dug and removed the tarp. The cacti had shriveled, and she greedily licked the condensation from the underside of the plastic. Lifting the jug, she was relieved to feel it pleasantly full of water. She had learned just yesterday how bitter cactus water was when you squeezed it fresh. And, like an epiphany, she remembered when her dad had taught her how to build a solar still. She walked on. After the mesa, she arrived at the frontier, the last stretch before leaving behind the Holy Kingdom. If she hadn't been so starved, she'd have been giddy. All she could call on now was a broad smile. There were still more than 50 kilometers ahead, probably 3 more days of travel, but at least she'd be out of reach of the patrols that surely pursued her. This area was filled with its own perils. Bandits starving just like her. Crawl warbands looking for fights with any holy paladins who crossed the border. Wild animals that wouldn't think twice about ambushing a single starved, dehydrated woman limping along. But it wasn't all bad. Snake Canyon promised easier travel once she descended its sheer cliffs, carved by the fast-flowing Snake River, whose water was fresh enough to drink from. When she reached the canyon's edge, she looked over the side and grew dizzy from the height. She couldn't see a way down and scanned the horizon. Then, to the east, she spied a herd of bald burros heading right to the edge. They weren't climbers like goats, but they had found a narrow, steep path that zigzagged downward. She shuffled toward them and followed behind, moving slowly, slower even than when she crossed Cactus Mesa. She made sure to step exactly where the burros stepped, one foot in front of the other. Step, observe. Step, observe. It all went well until a few meters from the bottom. She lost her footing, tumbling forward and crashing into the animal furthest behind. Startled, it leaned forward on its front legs and kicked with its hind hooves. On her back, she lifted her feet instinctively to shield her body and caught the full force in the tips of her toes. They bent backward, flat against the top of her foot, with a sound like several twigs snapping. She gasped, the wind nearly knocked out of her. The lizard-skinned creature bolted, crashing into and past several of its kin. She lay on the narrow path, crying in pain, pulling her knee to her chest and gripping her soul with both hands, rocking slightly as she sobbed. The pain was so overwhelming it eclipsed her exhaustion. She lost consciousness. Sometime later, while she was still out, a herdsman passed by and paused to stare at her. Her tarp had fallen open, exposing her battered body to the world. He looked without saying a word and leaned on his crook. Lash scars marred her chest and sides, likely her back too. Her pelvis and genitals bore patches of scar tissue. Branding, he supposed, as was common for certain offenses in the Holy Kingdom. Her hands were scabbed, her left missing the ring and middle fingers, her right missing the pinky. Deliberate scars ran horizontally across her face, from temple to temple, carefully avoiding her eyes but cutting across the bridge of her nose and eyebrows. "I wonder what she got caught for," he muttered to one of his goats. Kneeling beside her, he licked his fingers and placed them near her nose. Her breathing was strong and steady. She would probably live, he concluded. Gently, he closed the tarp around her body and tucked a few pieces of stale bread, leftovers from his lunch, inside. He took the jug tied to her waist and walked to the river to fill it, returning it upright in her hand. It was then he noticed a small pouch, poorly hidden under her makeshift robe. Lifting it, he felt its weight and heard the jingling of metal, though not coins. He tucked it back under her, concealing it a bit better. Most travelers here would ignore someone in her state. Some would even reason it wiser to let her die than risk a confrontation with a wounded animal. With his small flock, he walked on. Erte awoke with a start hours later. It was dark. She had no reckoning of the time. Her foot hurt intensely, but then she was distracted by the bread falling from her plastic robe. Confused, she looked around, only then noticing her water jug was full. There was no sign of anyone nearby. She drank deeply, then shoved the bread into her mouth. The first bite was large, but the bread was so stale, her jaw ached from chewing. She broke it into smaller pieces, dipping them in her jug to soften before eating. She carefully stood and could put weight on her foot if she avoided her toes. It had been at least half an hour since waking, she figured. There was a faint glow to the east. False dawn. Glancing at the ground, she saw the pouch, snatched it up and peered inside, sticking a finger in to count. She sighed, relieved, and tucked it back into her rope belt as before. She walked on. By the end of the day, she reached the canyon's edge. Though the canyon stretched on for many kilometers more, this was, roughly, where she needed to exit. She filled her jug one last time, knowing there would be no more safe water between here and Howler's Inn. Then gently, she waded into the river. It was slow here, wide and lazy. She went in as deep as her protruding hips. The water was cool, not cold, and felt wonderfully refreshing. Nervous, her footing was unsteady, and she had never learned to swim. But it had been so long since she'd enjoyed a bath. She allowed herself this brief moment of care. Bending forward, she submerged her head, then quickly straightened. Her hair, though matted and filthy, flung back, sending fat water droplets cascading past the shore. It felt like indulgence. It felt like pulling a single cherry bonbon from a carefully wrapped wooden box. It felt like letting it nearly melt in her mouth before biting through and flooding her tongue with its syrupy, juicy center. She wanted to get to the top before it was fully dark, so she shuffled to the shore, dressed, and followed a much easier path upward than the one downward had been. One of the skeletons passed her by on its way down. She had never seen one before. It nodded. She nodded. They exchanged nothing more. At the top, she walked a short distance from the path and sat on a large boulder. The sun had set, but some light still reached above the horizon, making everything a dark purple blue. The canyon's elevation declined gently before her, granting a spectacular view of the dry marshes below. A few campfires flickered in the distance. She made note of them. So close to Howlers, just a day and a half away, she guessed. Erte would take no chances. She would give those areas as wide a berth as she could afford. The night was bitterly cold, and she regretted wetting her hair. Its lingering dampness chilled her scalp until it finally dried. She hadn't slept much, shivering such as she was, and so she set out early. The patchy grass crinkled underfoot, stiff with frost. She walked on. 2 hours later, the ground began to level out. Patchy grass gave way to sandy scrubland. Years ago, centuries, this area had been a verdant wetland. But like everything else in this world, it had suffered and desiccated. Now, it was treacherous, with invisible beds of dry quicksand that could swallow the incautious traveler. Safe paths were marked with wooden stakes, painted in various colors to point to different destinations. Signposts without words for the illiterate majority. She had to follow the blue ones. By midday, she spotted humanoid shapes approaching from the distance. When she reached a pseudo-crossroad, she turned onto the red path, hoping to lose them. But minutes later, the figures followed. Her stomach twisted. She almost began to cry. She didn't want to see anyone until she reached Howlers. Instead, she ran. It was dangerous and painful, but so would being caught by those figures. As she learned from her dad, she made the choice that would keep her alive for the next 5 seconds. She would only worry about the 5 seconds after, when they came. The figures pursued, and with her foot, they were faster. They surrounded her, not human, but stickmen. Bipedal, with broad, oval-shaped heads and eyes perched on highly mobile stalks. Their long arms ended in 3 wide fingers, grotesquely disproportionate to their narrow frames. Most of them were naked, as was their custom. All except the apparent leader. It wore a rusted chain shirt, clearly made for a much bulkier man, draped loosely over its bony shoulders. In its hand, it held a long, thin metal rod. Trapped, nowhere to run, Erte froze. She locked eyes with the armed one to show respect, as was also their custom. The stickman wheezed, a strange, raspy sound. It raised the rod, pointing toward her. Erte remained still. It took a step closer. She took a step back, and its eye stalks wiggled, one rising while the other lowered, then back again. Again, the wheezing noise. Again, the pointing. Erte tried retreating farther, but bumped into another stickman behind her. It gently pushed her forward. The leader wheezed louder this time, jabbing the rod slightly toward her. Then she noticed. Its focus wasn't on her. Following the line of the rod, she realized it was pointing to the nearly full water jug on her hip. The wheezing wasn't a threat. It was a cough. The creature was thirsty. With care and slow movements, she untied the jug from her rope belt and placed it on the ground between them. Confidently, the clothed stickman stepped forward and snatched it up. It waved its arm and the others parted, clearing a path. Erte hesitated. She really hoped she might get the jug back. The stickman only lifted the rod again and pointed toward the horizon, in the direction that she was originally heading. She understood the message. Shoulders slumped, she turned and made her way back toward the blue stakes, carefully passing by the creature. As she walked by, it gave her a light whack across her buttocks. She understood that message too. She walked on. The rest of her trip passed without incident. When Howler's Inn came into view, her pace quickened, though each step sent pain up her leg. She didn't care, it was almost over. The signs outside the inn were lit in vibrant, beautiful colors, the types of colors outlawed in the Holy Kingdom for being immodest. Several men and women sat at tables outside, laughing, eating, and smoking. One of the women noticed Erte as she limped past. Erte glanced back and saw scars traced across the woman's eyes, from temple to temple. The woman lifted her glass slightly toward Erte and offered a pitying smile before turning back to her companions. Erte smiled weakly in return and pushed the inn's heavy door open. Whether the weight came from the door itself or her own exhaustion, she couldn't tell. Inside, the air was filled with noise, a happy noise, people talking and laughing over the clinking of glasses and clattering of plates. As she ambled in, several patrons turned to stare, but most averted their eyes out of politeness. Her top, now reduced to shreds, hid very little of her body. She made her way to the bar and sank onto a stool. A bartender walked over shortly after, leaning against the counter as he took in her ragged appearance. He let out a low whistle. "Did you make the long walk?" he asked. She nodded. "For that, you get a meal and a drink on me. Shower, too, if you want one." Erte blinked. The bartender pulled out a small menu, handed it to her, and asked, "Do you know how to read?" She nodded again. His face softened, the friendly smile replaced by a profoundly sad look. He understood. She nodded again. Daring to read as a woman in the Holy Kingdom, it was, of course, the reason she'd been enslaved. It was why her father, who taught her, had been burned alive before her eyes. It was why she had sworn vengeance against the man who had done both. And it was why she had finally carried that vengeance out 7 years later. The fat merchant, her owner, had carelessly left a letter detailing his plans to travel alone for a clandestine meeting to purchase contraband. She'd waited for this moment. Hours before his departure, she'd stolen away with the few items she had: the jug, the tarp, the rope, and an empty pouch. She'd gone to the meeting site ahead of him and waited. When he arrived, she struck him from behind with a rock, and she kept hitting him. Again and again she brought it down until his brains mixed with dirt and skull and blood, forming a paste. Panting, her hands trembling, she straddled his chest, opened the pouch, and dug her fingers into the brain paste. She collected what little she could find amidst the wreckage and tucked it all into the pouch. Before fleeing into the first night of her journey, she spat on the corpse. Erte handed the menu back to the bartender. "You need anything else?" he asked. "Clothes, and a room for a few days." She removed the pouch from her hip, turned it over, and spilled its contents onto the bar. Several gold teeth tumbled out, clinking against the wooden surface. "Will this cover it?" So, what do we do next? Asked a voice from just behind Erte's shoulder. Let's find out, she replied.